Hello everyone, today we reflect on a topic that we already addressed here and there, but not from this perspective. We made videos about the collective path to discipline, how chivalry in this sense was born, broadly meant, is very connected to it. I think we never made, up to this point, a video on the Swiss during the 14th to the 15th century. Have to fix that because we can't go on like this after 1100 videos. We talked about fear. We talk about, fear in the military sense, but the sense of vulnerability, security, etc. We talked about Germanic law, right? We talked about the comitatus and the adoptio per arma, the relation eventually in the vassalic beneficiary system between the senior and the vassus. So these are all things that if you adventure within the database of Schwerpunkt, let's call it like this, you can find, and we'll keep discussing because they're really crucial and to our military historical, and also broadly speaking political and social. And today what I want to stress is fundamentally the if you want a bit the juridical notion standing behind the military participation of members of a community. Here we take mostly the Germanic perspective, right? For the simple reason that, as you know, the early Middle Ages were in a sense dominated by Latin Germanic culture in the West, and from a political and military point of view especially, the Germanic institutions were the ones that had taken over, right? Culturally speaking, Germanic influence had a dramatic impact in the countries where actually that were all practically Romance, except, the British Isles, the few was remained there, but let's say that the major, we're talking about the Franks, the Visigoths, the Longobards, etc., they were essentially Romance countries, but with a political and institutional Germanic culture. And therefore, also what happened in the West, henceforth, and basically what we see in the Ancien Regime, is a product of this understanding. And naturally, as we always say, different countries in Europe had different developments, right? There were statal realities, there were tribal realities, still at the end of the modern age in Europe. Right, look at how advanced was the Kingdom of France just across the Channel. Look at Ireland. Well, not across the Channel, but relatively short in distance. They were still not very much different from their I can say that the ancient warriors, the Gaelic societies, but still they were different stages of that. And the Swiss, these are fascinating because technically speaking, Switzerland up to the 13th century hadn't been much of a properly what we mean as the highlands, right? Not Swabia. That also had been powerful. Think about the Hohenstaufen and think about southern Germany. Generally speaking, the Romanized one was more florid, more developed. But the Swiss are this exception, if you want, that pops out a bit out of nothing. Right, during the 13th century, that they controlled the passes between Swabia and Lombardy, right? So this was crucial, strategical for the Holy Roman Emperors because they would wage their own campaigns across the Alps, back and forth, right, from Italy, Sicily, Germany, etc. And therefore, the Saint Frederick II, that embodies more than all the others, this one had granted actually within the same Duchy of Swabia, because that's technically what we're talking about, these prerogatives, these rights to these essentially mountaineer communities. The Swiss are a bit an exception. We discussed them here and there actually already when talking about the development of early 14th century infantry. We see that they're not so, they don't break through, emerge immediately as strongly as the Flemish, right, or that literally win in pitched battles, right, face to face, right, properly victories against the heavy cavalry. The Swiss have a more gradual development. They manage to skillfully exploit the terrain, ambushes. They manage to outmaneuver, to surprise the Habsburgic armies. They earn their own freedom fundamentally, as and that's why today we're talking about the Friede, right? And what this means, because the Swiss Confederacy is actually born out of Landfried, that in the Holy Roman Imperial, probably in the German, royal practice was fundamentally when the monarch said, okay, we need to pacify the land, right? And at that time, history, because the Friede is something more ancient, as you will see now, and therefore, we are concerted for to put down the Friedlos. So those who were escaping actually this Friede, and that had been, as we made lots of videos on medieval Germany, outlining what was this chronically unregulated reality. I mean, this idea that this eventually would bring to the failure of a national monarchy, because the German princes simply didn't want to listen to that. So the Swiss had actually also began their path like that. They had imposed a Landfried, even though they were not any sovereigns, and this tells you what the moral forces naturally stood behind this popular movement back in the day. There were half, if you have to evaluate them politically or socially, the Swiss were half burghers, half citizens, say, and half mountaineers. So this also explains why this more gradual development. They were not living in the developed towns of Flanders as this mostly urban communities. They were something even properly more warlike, right? And this is important also looking at their military culture, because they're civilians here, properly in the sense of the inhabitants of a city, of a place, of a civitas, right, are the ones that, they're not professionals, right? They prefer to pay mercenaries. They usually have their own knights as well, because those are never out of the scene, even in Switzerland, of course. But, one thing is to be a mountaineer. That is by default one of the most warlike reality, because, you live in poor environments. You need to, your mind is set on the idea of emigrating every once in a while, going out there searching for fortune. This is studying every reality in some way. I mean, look at the Highlanders, look at, even in other places like the mountain, you think about the ones of Aragon, like the Valors. Think about there are studies that go together with other phenomena like transhumance. Look at even along the Apennines. There were, the valley dwellers were normally more warlike, right? They were usually poorer, so also the feudal aristocracy was stronger in a way, so that was kind of more militarized. As I say, there was a greater individual valor in fighting capabilities that was not matched by the broader collective capacities. But again, the Swiss were a bit in between, and they were lucky and skillful and courageous enough. So that's all together what makes military success all the time, to exploit the situation. I don't know why I'm talking specifically about that, but I would like to make you understand that they're a good example how to express how these thickly packed infantry formations lives on, in a sense, the legacy of the Germanic comitatus, right? In the late, and this is true a bit for the Middle Ages altogether, because these were not, there was people armies, there were not retinues and individual knights. And it is important here, in fact, to start from the courage of the knight, because that in our perspective, the knight is just a warrior, it's just a freeman, technically. I mean, the idea of nobility of blood actually stems from nobility of blood of the Wall people, right, of the Wall tribe, in a sense. Surely there is a sense of the aristoi, right, of the nobility, as eventually the feudal stratification of the communities would bring into, like, properly from a political, so like they were an elite, right? But initially, the idea from the Indo-European migrations, whatever, was that the entire people was superior, even in a sort of biological sense, right? It's a proto-racial thing, actually, to those they had conquered. So actually, the knight is the product of something similar to that, meaning that the knight, yes, embodies the peak of professionalism, especially by the 13th century. It's properly the fully developed the ultra elite, right? That's the moment of the apex, also the same feudal. But as we well know, civilizations fight in collective fashion. That is to say that without the single, without against the many, is nothing. It doesn't matter how strong he is individually. If you rely on a military system where individuals by themselves are just, what they make, the single fighters, you're weak military. That's a declaration of military inferiority, right? And this is exactly what tribal cultures were fundamentally, because there was a dialogue, actually. Those were evenly balanced societies for which still individuals like the berserkers, the orthodox, could live at the outskirts of that, were considered friedlos even later on. We've seen this. We made a video on the evolution of the berserker, of this figure that initially was literally the best that, those cultures could provide in terms of individual capacity, right? But they would work a bit borderline with, or overlapping properly with the comitatus. But that is the idea. It's also another migratory Indo-European thing that you find in every society, right, from the Romans to that in spring, since this shepherds society, etc., they would have made, new people would come of age. There was not enough resources for them to survive. This is typical of the steppe and or of this other, places at the outskirts of sedentary civilizations, all would try to pour in, etc., that would have to go out there, fundamentally conquering, raping, because raping was a fundamental process in the fact that, you were superior to a guy that you killed and you could take the wife of. This is, think about the rape of the Sabines in Roman mythology, right? That's, has hardcore, realistic it can be, properly from the deepest of, in the sense of the, these tribal civilizations. And the women were even in theory to accept that, because given that their men were warriors and they all lived by the same moral standards, the woman would have to recognize that he who had slaughtered her own man was essentially superior and worthier to generate for children for and warriors for, because that's what it is, right? The idea is that a true woman has to generate a true warrior, and that was the mentality behind. It's very, you understand that it's very genetic, right? It's the idea that's how primitive these peoples were in terms of the individuality. Right, then eventually when civilization spread, right, not just they civilize in a broader, properly civilian sense, but even though the scale of destruction actually can be actually even greater and more effective, and the St. Romans in this sense are the proof of that, but they also realize, as always, because heroic warfare never quite factually existed in reality, because there was always somebody fighting alongside the hero, that naturally collective training is superior, right? At the point that, again, at some point there is a critical mass that no individual can stop at a certain point. Doesn't matter whether it's Rambo or what. I love Rambo, by the way, but, I know it's bullshit, right? And I know it's bullshit exactly because it involves, in this sense, a sense of this, that it's a primitive idea that the single guy can make it all. And it's very fascinating because genetically we are hardwired to this idea that because it's the most simple, it's the most immediate. What do? You are in charge of yourself. You're always one. You're always a monad, right? And more complex systems are more difficult to understand, so they're the ones that also instinctively you don't understand, intellectually, etc. You have to learn, right? If you, again, so that's why the sympathy even why towards tribalism is so easy today, because if people naturally are undereducated, they know nothing about history, they just see this clan group kind of hooliganism or ethno-nationalism, what people look like as a discriminant, right? Of course they're going to be tribal and even closer to that sense of racism or proto-racism that we were sensitive today, racist, because most of them are factually racist, but properly it's because they lack the notion of properly what is that makes a civilization. And we are responsible for it because we don't educate children enough, and this is sad. But the courage of the knight, so in a sense, as I was saying before, the knight was still trained to be a perfect individual fighter, because still in medieval times, even in the 13th century, the individuality of it was necessary. Like just, for example, in siege warfare. Siege warfare, we think, they needed infantry for siege. Yes, because for the blockade. But factually, the stormtroopers, those who, assaulted the ramparts, they climbed on the ladders while people were throwing stones and crossbow bolts at them, were knights, obviously, because they had the best armor, the best protection. They were the ones who had to physically have the psychophysically, actually, because it starts all from the brain. It's not even about these weren't superheroes physically speaking. They were hyper beefy, muscular. They were just tough as hell granitically. From a mental point of view, we often outlined what the mentality of a medieval knight we think could be like. In a sense, we know what it was, but we cannot today, by 21st century standard, even come close to factually understand what it meant, right? These were people who, first of all, they didn't have any idea of what concretely the difference between a civilian and military reality was, right? Also because the environments where they lived were border, line, just shaping in that sense. But properly, these were people who were the true killing machines. So again, in order to be a killing machine, it's not how much muscles you have; it's much how your mind is set. And these people could essentially cause a democide if they had the possibility, physically speaking, to, because from a mental point of view, they were conceived exclusively to kill people. This is and this is actually what we also forget, and we will talk about this today, properly about what's the same meaning of warfare, right? The military instrument is not designed to give, opportunities of work to people, or to have a dialogue about what happens in society, whatever. Those may be political and social things, and of course, always invest the military and control the military, because that's the Clausewitzian paradigm. But if we took, we extrapolated the military factor as such, we would have the military factor is designed virtually. The objective of war is always to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, but this factually means in reality that it has to pass through physical annihilation. That is to say, in a way, war is violence by definition. Not that it's like that. It is violence. It's the same thing, and violence is designed to kill and to literally wipe out physically the enemy resistance. And these men were the top that the world civilization had created at the time to achieve that. And the fact that, of course, society was so elite at that point, it had produced this spearhead of men that were tough. They were granitic and completely devoid, not of moral scruples, because these people could be actually people of beautiful and wonderful and exceptional, poetic sensitivity. Some of the greatest knights of the time, the great bloodshedders, were the famous Minnesänger. They had, again, as modern psychology, sociology, criminology tells us, the peak of male creativity is the peak of men's criminality and violence, right? So those were the full picture of that, and that's exactly what the world, because this was a generational thing, right? Part of the reason why we don't know so much documented, it's not just a broader political and social problem, but it's the idea that war at the time for these people was so normal that nobody would have thought, like, I have to write down what it means to be a knight in the 13th century, because factually everybody has always known and will ever know what a knight does, right? Unfortunately, it's not the case. We would have liked them to tell us, and sometimes, very rarely, we find somebody, who also in fact was illiterate, who would write down certain things about that, and from that we understand that this was the thing, that this was the deal, right? But the knight in itself, not even in this knights were trained to use any kind of weapon, and they would. The myth, yes, knights used crossbows on horseback. Everywhere, in every situation, could do that. We don't have. It's not just the thickly packed, compact, charge, etc. Remember, there's mostly of the sieges, of skirmishes, of things like that. Most of these people see that the most varied tactical employment in many ways. But the important is, as we were saying before, that civilization in the history of mankind is incarnated by peoples that are effective in collective training and that fight in combined arms all together with a level of that is what makes the superiority not just of the military but by reflection of the political and social quality of its civilization, right? And this is a moral thing, right? People will always trick you into thinking, the great empires that were built on a sea of blood. Yes, because, tribes were built over flowers and cologne. Like, what the fuck does that even mean? Human groups always had to fight for some reason at some point, right? The discriminant here is those who knew how to do it and those who didn't know how to do it, right? Or at least they were better or worse at it. Right, and you have to be humble enough to recognize that what you have today is also the product of this, because civilization developed, sadly enough, also through such things, and not because of evil in that sense, or not only at least, but because in order to do this stuff, people had to make their brain work, and incidentally also to prevent actually senseless, bloodshed, as that's kind of, compactly for civilization to maintain its own cohesion and stability, that are definitely the harbor from which you can, make surely civil rights and other stuff flourishing, as it has factually happened in the history of mankind. From tribes, such things do not emerge, right? So that's quite important. Even though, of course, we all come from tribes, so gradually the thing obviously started from there, and we must understand them too, because again, if you don't get at that base, at that root, there's no way we can understand the whole process and the difference, and why it happened, and why somebody, was able to make a positive accomplishment regarding to this. So, in other terms, the courage of the knight, right, as such, right, is obviously mediated by the community, right? In other terms, it's a group valor, right? What do you do things for? Think about it. Most of the things we do, it's because society, politics imposes us in a way or another, right? Even indirectly. Right? What do? You don't have a job yet. What the hell, man? Have to, and deep inside that, maybe you disagree, but you know that other people are going to pressure, and people do that. So, knights were the elite. They had the whole burden of their whole community on their backs, because the entire community worked exclusively for the knights. Like all the church, all the peasantry, all the work, were all essentially, at this point in history, working to provide the knight the endless amount of hours of training, right? Before even the cost of a sword or a horse, but even eating, of course, that were a part of it. Properly the availability, the training. How do you have a crusader if you don't have a religious indoctrination? And you need a civilization to produce such tools, such material, and that is how gradually the thing happened. And on the field, this naturally substantiates in that collective coordination that is born within the of the comitatus, right? Because this starts effectively with that of initially. So we're going very much back in time here, but substantially chivalry is about this of the youthfulness of the youth collected, gathered around a senior, right? So the older guy, the boss. And again, as we often make in that sense the equation that these were essentially mafia, yes, it's correct, because in tribal society there is only mafia ruling. There's not another, possible, like they don't have any other cultural horizon beyond that. Things start coming better over time. But what this substantiates itself in, morally speaking, is courage. Right? It's a type of courage that is needed to go out there in the field, again, as we were saying before, against the most unspeakable odds sometimes, and killing like hell, right? Without like crazy, covered in blood, and just to making it, because again there was no other way to functionally make it but that, right? It's a type of courage, the model of which is the ritual brotherhood that is created within the comitatus, right? It's the idea that I do this because there is somebody next to me that if I don't do this is risking his life, and if I don't do this thing amplifies within the whole formation, and if we all do not do this, we all put each other at risk, and factually without this moral force. So you understand the Clausewitzian paradigm here is fully accurate. The whole unit collapses, and this is the difference naturally in warfare between moral forces of an inspired, determined, competent, trained, experienced formation, and maybe a materially identical one that, however, morally is nothing, because maybe they're just raw records. They They have a completely different background and whatever. That's one of the reasons why also, that's all I say, any kind of recreation today or trying to hope of how this man fought consistently from an individual point of view is ridiculous, because you lack the single most important thing to reenact, that is fundamentally their mentality. And without that, it's nothing. Right, you can't function. You can reconstruct the panoply of a knight. You can't tell more or less, of course, how it worked. You can't feel how much it weighed. You can learn moves, things like that. But what we will never be able to replicate is the only thing that made a knight concretely. That is its mindset, right? And this mindset was deeply rooted in this communitarian mindset. The comitatus, since Tacitus said, this youth was all they were all. If they joined, it was a privilege. It was an honor. Right, always remember that the comitatus, like the Germanic comitatus, the Gaelic fiannas, etc., these were divine, properly religious and military brotherhoods, because these were devotees of the deity of war. They had essentially already handed their own soul to the deity. That is, when you entered the comitatus, you were ritually another person that technically didn't belong anymore to himself, but to the comitatus and to the deity, of course. The medium being the senior, the boss, that in this sense was the mind, right? And the others were just the mascules, in a sense. So hence also the age segmentation. The senior is an older guy, because he has seen it all before, right? And the youth instead is the elastic, fresh, quick, speedy one that, however, still has a lot to learn. And in that learning, there is something atrocious in it, because they are the ones that have to show off. They are the ones that have to show this blind and flexible courage in front of the others in order to be worthy of the comitatus, because otherwise they will be sacrificed. Right, literally meaning that it will be ripped apart and their guts sacrificed to the dead. And because if there is a weak element within it, it's useless, it's dangerous. Right, this is a privilege and a duty and an inferic devotion to deity. Basically, you're already dead, and that's what all the whole Vodanic thing is also about. The symbolism of the acquired knowledge, the visos, the idea of wisdom acquired over the just blind, youthful. Courage, right, and that stands in the boss, right? But the other guys are here properly. They have to behave in a way that shows that risk, right? And in fact, that the German youth, like all, I don't know, also the Celts. There's also the Romans. Think about the Velitas, etc. It was pretty standard pack, right, of ancient peoples in that regard. Were the ones who skirmished in the front. They were the ones that had accumulated less wealth. Because they hadn't killed enough people yet to pick, an expensive weapon or whatever the boss actually could provide them with, because he knew that at least, he could give that effort, given that he was the one that had to keep it together. Redistribution was crucial in this, because there is no comitatus that works if the boss keeps all the treasure, right? The reason why there are warriors that gather around him is that he is successful because he has looted all that stuff, but he also has to pay the troops with the loot, because otherwise would they have fought for, right? There is also the more concrete reality, but that's not quite being part of the comitatus in itself. It's rather maybe other bands that associate independently with their other bosses, etc. And that's how you make a tribal army at that point. So consider that, I don't know, Germanic chieftains in their free spare time, as we're told by the Romans, basically had fun by betting on, naked young men running in a forest of spearheads, and of course every once in a while that would be a simulation of what they would have had to see in battle, and of course some of them would simply transfix themselves there, would remain dead, and that was the nice test. It was saying, okay, that guy was not good, right? Was not quick enough, was fast enough, agile enough, right? These are the moral backgrounds from which these people came from. So just to have an idea of what it meant at the root, what chivalry fundamentally was about, aside from the embellishments of the courtly poetry, all the thing, but factually, right? These were warriors again, and they fought like that. And the social courage in the Swiss infantry, as I was saying before, is slightly, right, there are some differences in this sense, because there is, why do we pick them so much as a standard here? Because the Swiss infantry here had a a mandatory courage. That is to say, there was some regulation that understood, of course, at that point in history that there had to be a uniform, or at least a standard, let's say, collective, collective glue, right, and that substantiate individually in the courage, right, that is underlined, in fact, also by the very harsh punishment that were reserved to the cowards, right? That is something transposed in a bit of a different environment, because you know that the comitatus existed as much as there was a zippe, right? And the difference here is sometimes blurred, because if we had to extremize the two things, the comitatus and the zippe existed at a time where societies were already a bit more developed than before, because at the very origin of the Indo-Europeans, of Romulus, the rapes, etc., all that stuff, and the entire people was the comitatus, in a sense, approximating, even though at the time it wasn't even quite like that. But the idea is that every people was that bound to their moral duty, their religious and military duty, because there was no other lifestyle but pillaging, raiding, exterminating, enslaving, right? Because resources were so poor, there was factually no other way to live like that. Why do you think tribes exist and they have a warlike culture? It's fundamentally because of that. There's no inherent deep, identitary thing. It's literally they do it because otherwise they starve to death, or they're actually exterminated, enslaved, or raped by someone else, right? Which in fact is here with the Methodist still is all one, right? That it's in fact it's fundamentally the political cohesion that make the same thing. Right, and this is true both in the comitatus and the zippe. The zippe represents, here it said something different. The comitatus is fundamentally this handful of warriors that form a war band coming out of society. Right, they literally come out of it, like they maintain a tie with it. They maybe even live around. Like the brotherhoods, there are those guys who were animal beasts, like the berserkers, the Ulfednar. They literally lived around the nearby, the outskirts of the village. They were not conceived as human beings anymore. They were considered as kind of animals. Like, in fact, even the Friedlos of the later Viking era, when these things had died out, of course, were this bunch of disadapted, psychopathic maniacs who went around just to being brigands, right? And that were still imbued with this atrociously ferocious, frenetic, even properly mental problems, because literally these people got addicted to their own same idea of possession of the divinity. There are some passages in the sagas that are quite eloquent. Like if you read it under the lights of modern psychiatry, you understand that there was a problem there. They were even pointing it out. So very fascinating. We made videos, in fact, that video about the role of the berserkers and Ulfednar in the Germanic society speaks abundantly of that. Anyhow, what I was saying is that this was the war band, right, more or less, and went around, roaming around, right? These were the mercenaries, I don't know, that you could find in the Roman army, the numeri, they weren't the federati in a strict sense, because the federatus would have been the entire people at that point. We're talking properly about the single war bands, right? They would, I don't know, go from Germany, employ the Roman Empire, roaming a little bit the Mediterranean, things like that, and then coming back home and maybe have been proud of that and making their own share of money, maybe centralizing a little bit in their own tribe to have accumulated loot and pay and a military experience in the Roman army. And gradually, that's also how the Germans Romanized in a military sense, right? You can easily see it in the history from the early Germans that were literally, primitive with clubs at the time of Augustus into, look at the 4th century Alemannic armies, that they were something, right? Still not a dramatic difference, but in terms of political cohesion, the strategic projection, of course, they were much better than those scattered tribes of earlier times. Now, and the zippe is something else. The zippe is the village, right? The zippe, brutally, right, as approximately so. The village as in theory, like the civilian reality that is never civilian, because as we know in the Germanic law, these still people are still as freemen. They are technically warriors, right? That in a much more civilized reality like the Roman one, yes, every Roman citizen substantiates its own freedom because he's a warrior, because he can join the army, because he is being chosen by the god as the chosen people to have that right and duty, right? But practically things are different. So that is what's the difference? That the Zippe would go at war when it was needed, right? But most of the people, even though they were surely habituated to raiding, warfare, all this stuff, depending on the times, etc., they were not really professional troopers, right? The Comitatus was kind of a professional troop because they factually lived just doing that, right? So they were true professionals. The Zippe was like a militia, right, in the substance. And in fact, the Swiss cantons that put together and decide to rebel to the Habsburgs are fundamentally that, right? They are people. They are this broader communities, naturally in a very different time in history, but still conceptually, in that kind of solidal, communitarian cohesion, are going at war, right? As an entire people, as their entire community, right? And it goes without saying that in the history of mankind, the Zippe wins in practice because the Comitatus is good in a sense, but it can never fully, even just by numbers, properly compete with the majority, right? These were the spearhead of the formation, if you want. They were the ones that were given the privilege of the place of honor, basically the suicidal role in battle, because that's what they were devoted to. Again, those were not human beings anymore. They were simply a pawn of the divinity. They didn't count, right? The Zippe instead, yeah, they were human beings, right? And they were many, and they naturally were the ones that were presented with the the greatest organizational problems. That is to say, one thing is roaming around with, 100 guys that loot and take whatever, they sustain themselves like that along the way. One thing is, to protect a village with a territoriality, with a threat, with a substantiality. Of course, these peoples eventually migrate. They still have a mentality that overlaps, in a sense, with this warrior one. In fact, the Comitatus wouldn't always be, wasn't completely outcast. Some of them were, but it's obvious that the successful warrior eventually wanted to settle down, literally, and maybe to create a new village or to properly have, as we've seen, children. The idea of this was the stock who made it and had to replicate itself happened not just through the community in itself, that sometimes even presented features of, homosexual ritual rape, because these were monosexual communities, that they were abused in a traumatic, we can't even imagine what a comitatus really was. It was some of the most appalling realities and the shocking realities in the history of mankind. But at the end of the day, this was all aimed at properly settling in a place, grabbing someone else's land, and therefore transforming into a Zippe, because these guys finally would have their women, finally would have their farms, their slaves, right? And the Zippe had been created like that. And so there were many war bands living within this ever more developed and articulated political and social realities, and kind of blending in, right? It's how effectively you arrive to feudalism when you have these guys that now are fully integrated as the professional military, because they also embody the oligarchy that keeps all the others under, right? So freemen, goodbye, really, that they're all serfs by that point, and they have monopolized that kind of capacity, hence chivalry, hence properly what we think about knighthood, of the, the preeminence of these guys at so many levels. In fact, that's the point. The Swiss infantrymen were scum, right? The Habsburg knights that were killed by them, and that was the shocking thing. Like, the Flemish burghers, the slaughter, the flower of French cavalry at Courtrai. Like, these people were considered nothing, because factually, up to they had been nothing. Right, because it was the elite that had always ruled to them. So that's why it's remarkable, of course, how this collective value starts emerging at that point in a political sense, to say, no, we want to be free. Switzerland being one of the most emblematic, if not properly the most, under certain points of view, country in this picture, because eventually the Flemish get, Courtrai is basically the only thing they made, right? They do something at Montpellier, but fundamentally up to the 1500s, they get ass kicked by all, still essentially French Burgundian armies, and they don't change a damn. The Swiss remain fundamentally independent to this day, right? In spite of their, alternating, their rise and fall of their mercenary fame or whatever, but they embody this, constitutionally speaking, right? It's their culture, it's their identity, and their pride, right? And so this was won through such, through the Zippe, if you want, through this communitarian courage that is the one, again, the political cohesion that makes it all. Right, it's not that these guys had magic weapons or whatever. Yes, the Swiss halberds surely contributed to the fortunes of these people, but the truth being that without political cohesion, without a common will, a common vision, you lose. Right? What do you think? I don't know. In other realities, why were the Belgians and the Helvetians? Here they overlap with the Swiss a little bit. No, it's different. But more or less, they were Celto-Germanic, at least. But why were they the best? They had the highest military quality in the Celtic world because they had some special weapon or some special. No, it's because they were more political, more nationally cohesive, and that's it. That's what it makes it, right? So this is fascinating. Even if you look at the history of the same Habsburgs later on, the split into these two branches, that was very weak, right? It's a bit the problem of feudalism since Frankish times, the idea that at every generation the male son wants its own Jew, right? And it splits the country, and that's terrible, right? Because but it's part of that same culture, so it fits the idea. If that happened, it's not because of some standard form. It's probably for the lack of the enforcement of a centralized government, given those governmental structures of the time. So in the thick hedgehog of the mountaineer pikemen of Switzerland, Wu lets himself being taken by fear and breaks the ranks, put in danger not just the life of the companions, right, of his companions, because his cowardice is first of all a function of his asociality, right? And this was deeply understood, ingrained in those realms, because according to the old Germanic law, in fact, the vile is at the same of the criminal, as somebody who breaks the Friede, right? That is the intimate connection on which properly cohabitation is based. That is properly the tribal cohesion, right? What are tribal identities? Well, if not, people who get together because they have a common goal, right? There is no color here. It's properly what you want, right? And so the vile and the criminal are those that in a certain sense have put in danger community, and towards whom the communitarian solidarity is thus suspended, right? Because it is denied then the connection of Friede of Peace. This is extremely important because you know that Friede is literally peace, right? But in the Germanic language, Friede is not peace in a pacifistic sense. We have to stay in peace, right? No, Friede in a warlike society is a peace acquired through violence. It's the idea that either through military power, having slaughtered all your neighbors in that process, or displaying deterrent capacity, other peoples leave you in peace, and also because you are pacified, you're cohesive, you're in fact harmonic within your own same community, right? So the ancient, this is interesting in an anthropological perspective, because you understand it derives from this ancient German idea that, if society was cohesive internally, it was strong. And hell, that is as true as you can imagine. There is also in other cultures this realization. This is more or less actually in every culture, in every society, it's acknowledged, right? It seems we have forgotten it today, right? For the amount of distraction and disorientation. And yes, this is the trick. It's you see, as all things military in this regard, they're not complicated. They're actually very simple. Are some of the simplest things ever. But nobody said that they are easy, right? So people are both intellectually disoriented and morally bankrupt not to understand that it's silly to be divided, that there is, because we're not pressured anymore. That's the point, right? We're not immediately confronted with the intrinsic danger that this separation brings. That the fact that, if there is a disagreement in your country, well, who cares? I still have my house, my car, my bank account, all this stuff. It's okay, but maybe your country is going downhill. Maybe other countries are taking advantage of your political influence, of your markets. What do you achieve by being individualistically at that point? And then that's the Swiss example is fantastic, because it shows, right? It went on the path of modernity because it showed how an army of countrymen, of commoners, of mountaineers could factually be morally superior even to the superheroes, let's say, of the time, such as could be an imposant Habsburgic knight that surely was, one of the most frightening things that you could find on a battlefield, and that the Swiss had the guts to withstand the charges of. And that is the measure of the moral superiority. We made a video about the Battle of Courtrai. How did the Flemish win at the Battle of Courtrai? What is the deeply, the military wisdom, the tricks, this and no. Basically, it was done just by standing their ground, because they were determined. If there hadn't been that, right, there would have been nothing else. Also because war was factually made always in the same ways, and there weren't many ways that were here in the early 14th century infantry. We see, yes, the fact that certain weapons were used in a certain way, certain terrains were chosen, but more or less what had always happened, right? What actually makes the difference is how cohesive these people were. The fact that they either would stand their ground, that they would die or lose everything they had that they thought, to be worthy of a free life. And so they had their own thing. Naturally, it's not a certainty, meaning that that's not always enough, right? And the measure being the fact that in the previous centuries, nobody had challenged heavy cavalry in that way, albeit commoners did exist on the battlefields, etc. So they would even sometimes would never get the upper hand. So that shows you naturally the graduality of such historical phenomena and processes. We made videos about this, we talked about them, but the crucial thing to understand here is properly the difference in moral forces. That is what the one did do. So in all this, you understand that that just as the criminal, the coward, becomes devoid of peace, right? Because he's properly rejected by society, he becomes a friedlos, right? So civil death is decreed towards him, right? And from that moment onwards, he's treated at the same time, at the same kind of way of a ferocious beast. And in that sense, the berserkers, all this stuff, were partly this, meaning that these people were marked socially by the fact that they were not acceptable for society, right? They in different times, as we were saying before, the attitude towards this warrior beasts changed over time. But in a sense, the more civilized these countries became, and the more they realized that that individualistic, charismatic idea that is typical of the warrior is dangerous, right? It's disgusting how in today's culture and society, just because people tweet them or improperly use it, and like journalists are the first guilty of that, there is this resurgence of the idea that a 21st century military in a Western country they are warriors, right? It's bullshit. That's historical, military, strategical, political, civil, moral literacy. Those are not warriors. They're citizen soldiers, and the reason why you start calling them soldiers, warriors, actually, is that unfortunately, yes, there is a regression. Those are, in some contexts, are coming back to be some sort of caste, right, that fights naturally for their own prestige and charisma, etc., right? That is to say, if you encounter, as I did, some military man that, covered in tattoos from head to toe, with Odinic symbolism, etc., that spits, kind of ethno-nationalistic and racist bullshit about, the brown people being killed, by blonde, blue-eyed guys, that you understand there is a moral disease, because that is what would make a comitatus warrior. He would maybe be good for that, right? Except they're fundamentally pussies, actually, to those standard, because they can't even reach that, and if they studied military history, it would be a bit more humble, but properly because they would get their ass kicked by an army that is as determined as these examples we just made, that of course are superior to any kind of warriorhood. The Greeks had already understood it quite well, as we recalled many times. In every single clash between Athena and Ares, of course, Ares loses, right? Because warriors are impulsive, beast-like, charismatic, individualist. They don't understand the logic of civilization. It doesn't belong to their cultural tools, right? And that's the reason why we have long crushed them under the heel of civilization. And so any kind of sympathy towards them, it can be, maybe human, in the sense that, yeah, we were that, because back in the day, any of our ancestors was that, and we are substantially designed biologically still to be. Not maybe those warriors, because also war is, it is a process, right? But technically, like, we can be that, right? And the fact that we are not, we should be thankful for, but also understanding the path, the process, because without that, there can't quite be any, in fact, properly awareness of when the thing get reversed. At this point, this topic I'm making is making so many times become familiar, but I wonder, like, do you know any person in society, in the world, where in any kind of media or etc., that tells you these things? I don't know any of them, right? So I think it's important to be sensitized about this, and literally there is a process of estrangement. It's obvious that you tend, even today, to stay away from such people, right? They are after, this kind of warrior, ethno-nationalistic, tribalistic, hooliganistic attitude, where are they condensated? Among the scum of society, the marginated, the poor, those that feel to be inertly, that since they don't have any other instrument to prevail, to succeed, to make it, they resort to this primitive stuff, right? And of course society emarginates them, and that's actually a positive thing, because it's a civic thing, and because the only hope for these people to change is to properly to appreciate the fact that they are emarginated, and that there is some social justice in this, not a leftist one, like they have monopolized the use it, but properly a civil dignity of human morality in this, and this unfortunately escapes actually the majority of people, right? That's why populism is so appealing, both in the right and in the left, because most people do not study these things. They don't understand these things factually, right? They fit mostly in the warrior mindset, and they don't know that they have already lost, because there is always somebody who is more civilized than them that will take advantage of them. And it's even right in a historical perspective. So this shouldn't be seen as something strange. For example, among the old Germans, the freeman is such because he's armed, right? And the armed has the right to be such as a freeman, right? Who doesn't bear arms basically rejects his free condition and his contribution to the life of the community of which he is part. Right, so in the measure in which the free German for the free German, that fighting is a right, is a social service. The coward self-segregates, right? It qualifies as asocial, as an enemy, and an objective enemy of society and the community to which it belongs, right? So again, that's in Nute, as you see, even in a Germanic tribal context, the realization, because we're all human beings, independently from wherever we come from and what stage of development, where that there is an intelligence, there is a dignity of human goodness, the rationality of human goodness that makes things work, right? And they would understand it much better at the time, in a sense, because in relative terms, because they were more pressured than us, as we understand. So even at the time, they had understood that yes, these marginated people might have been ferociously wild and making, being this a good, rendering good service, even maybe incompetent in certain situations. But as for the whole community, they were basically an end to themselves, or something barely integrated or integratable in society, right? So if we project this in the rough unacceptability, let's say, of the pikeman square, right, for which the courage and esprit de corps were two ethical parameters and two instruments of work, literally, through which in battle, you escaped defeat and hunger in life, the coward constituted also a technical threat. And so the greater the civilization and the greater the damage that the coward, that he who doesn't want to participate, doesn't take a position, and unfortunately today it's come to this, that the cowards are the ones that actually stick in the tribalistic mindset, because they wouldn't understand how to risk to properly invest their lives in like what, right? So there is a superior, counterintuitive, sometimes even counterinstinctive function. In fact, one of the greatest lies in that we are constantly fed is that war is inhuman, right? It's something that doesn't belong. It's to beasts rather than man. This is the bullshit culturalist, racist view that unfortunately, has spread thanks, champions like, Little Hart and Keegan, that of course have neither properly even opened the Volkskriege and have completely equivocated basically the entire history of mankind from a military point of view and beyond. War is, by definition, anything but beast-like. It's counterintuitive. It's the most rationalized activity that humans carry out, because surprise, surprise, is the one that you go into risking your life. So something that is instinctive by definition, right? And that if it was just ruled by emotions, by instinct, would immediately be avoided. Instead, it's not like that. Right. War means standing your ground, for example, for human rights, for going out there and saying, I will not live in tyranny. I will not be living in the moral and material misery of a totalitarianism or a dictatorship. It's the value of resistance. It's something that goes at so many levels in politics and in society. And that is the same reason why we live in a free world still. And why, things could go otherwise. And still, in fact, there is the consistent risk of them going like that. And surely what is happening currently at so many levels of our societies do not help. Because people are resorting to tribalism and to such forms of individualistic, hence useless, from a broader humanitarian point of view, attitude that is only fed by political illiteracy, ignorance, lack of education, historical literacy, mostly lack of civic education, democratic culture, and basically any understanding of our world from an overall perspective, right? And we all fall into it. I would go as far as that, meaning that obviously we cannot rationalize everything at the fullest, right? But there is a huge practical difference between a person who acknowledges this and a person who just goes on there without any kind of, well, you know that, right? You look at people who support still, extremistic movements. You know that they are like children, right? There is nothing like in certain forms of, political violence, like take the far right, the far left. You think those are deep, intellectual body? They're chill. They're soft as hell. They're like they break easily. They don't have an orderly, rational, and capable way of essentially expressing their feelings. They don't have self-discipline, and they don't have it because they don't have that political culture that of the superiority of the collective training over the individual one. And of course, they are going to stress that at so many levels, and that's the same problem I was addressing, for example, also in that video I made on, responding to a beautiful consideration of Schola Gladiatorum, these issues, that we are not making enough to teach people when they approach history, when they approach things like reenactment or heme or whatever, that the properly, this is probably the greatest issue we are facing at this point. And it's literally, if you want a leitmotif of all what we know from the actual good, the broader awareness about our own civilization in any kind of branch of historiographical inquiry, like from politically, social, yes, there are lots of people who are going astray, but the reason why they do is that properly they don't focus on the overall. Right, that's another problem. It's also methodological, it's also cultural, yes, scientific in a sense, deeply scientific actually, in if you want to be precise. But there is a wall that we can't really understand. We cannot lose ourselves into chit-chat or put things in relativistic terms, right? So we need also to be harsh sometimes. We need to be able to say, no, you cannot do this, because if you do this, you put everybody in danger, not just yourself, right? And always remember, that's the strength of a civilization. It's scale capacity, the capacity of moving as one. That is what makes the thing, historically speaking. And not always with the best intentions, meaning that, of course, there can be some mismanagements. Like, it's hard, for example, to see any, more deteriorated moral or cultural background than the National Socialist one. Hell, but those guys went, they invaded all fucking Europe, like, they could consistently, change history like that. So that tells you how, from the other side, the weakness that was displayed, just tolerating them, or tolerating communism, or tolerating any kind of vicious, fanatic, ignorant, a morally inferior ideology, right, is a form of weakness that is you're directly responsible. In fact, this is what most people do not want to admit, that even if you sit there do nothing, you are responsible about something, because you don't live in a vacuum, right? And ignoring these things equates to be a coward itself, and to be guilty for it, and to pay for it. Right, and that's why also so many people revert to tribalism at that point, because they have lost the plot of what is actually happening, because they don't realize that what happens to them is happening exactly because they have let other disadapted people doing the same. So they see this kind of, they have lost the initiative, that moral force doesn't stand from their side, because they have consistently reversed to a culture of victimhood that makes them being on the defensive and being passive aggressive and fundamentally incapable and hysterical and lots of other people are taking advantage of them. People that not necessarily are maybe the best moral beings, but that are surely superior to them in that regard, and know how to exploit their weakness, their fragility, and their incapacity, because it gets down really to that. So, yeah, this is more or less what I wanted to say today. We will keep talking naturally about these topics here and there. They're very important to stress. And for today, we stop it here. However, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.